The revelations coming out of some of the hearings about supposed involvement with the Trump administration in Russia and or the surveillance of the Trump people during the campaign and afterwards, I think the most important thing that has been gleaned is that on numerous occasions, the intelligence community, quote, incidentally collected information about U.S. citizens involved in the Trump transition. Translation: your materials, everything is being swept up into this giant database, which right now they're technically not supposed to be using. But apparently some of this incidental information got circulated to other people in the Obama administration to be used against the campaign, which is what the whole debate about. But the whole core issue here is not about the campaign or about Russia, but the fact, just as we suspected from early on, that all sorts of information is being swept up from American citizens and, given the necessity, can be leaked or spread about, even if it's in violation of law and a felony. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Leffler here with you. Of course, that has something to do with the deep state. What is the government with inside our government? In reality, it's probably the real government. It's the one that never changes. Faceless, unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, some of whom are bureaucrats and others of whom are there to act as whatever they need to act at, either supporting or acting against the current administration. Dr. Dennis Cuddy joins us, former senior associate at the U.S. Department of Education, also author of books such as The Globalists and other books dealing with the nefarious goings-on underneath the surface, both in our government and on a worldwide basis. So I guess the deep state can't be separated from intelligence, can it?
Yeah, and it's been going on a lot longer than people realize. I experienced a little variation of it when I was up in the federal government during the Reagan years. You would have people, well, let's go backwards. During this recent activity, what you have is not only there are military rules of engagement, but there are intelligence rules of engagement. So initially these things start out being presented as very limited. We will do this in a very limited way and trust us. But a lot of this incidental chatter that was picked up during the Obama administration is shared with more and more and more people, which is what President Obama did. But the various mechanisms for doing this go back. There was something 25 years ago called Promise, and that's without the E on the end of it, which could pick up chatter from all over the place. You also would have series of evasions of law, such as with the Echelon. We would pick up things, the CIA, which would have to do with, let's say, British citizens, and then the British would pick up things having to do with American citizens, and that way they would evade the laws against, say, the CIA spying on American citizens and so on. But it was actually globally as well. Osama bin Laden, for example, I remember you had at one point Mike Hayden, who was head of the NSA, saying Osama bin Laden has a better communication system available to him than we do. And I was wondering how this guy in a cave on a dialysis machine would be able to do that. And then I found that the Iridium network of the 12 relay stations that transfer cell phone messages globally. One of them was the Great Wall Corporation of China, and another one for the Middle East, that one was the Saudi bin Laden network. So the picking up of information, whether it's through cell phones, and technically, I suppose Trump shouldn't have said the word wiretap, should have used surveillance or something like that, has been going on for a very long time. The information is shared when it's limited in many ways. If the circle of individuals that have it available to them becomes wider and wider and wider. Now, back during the Reagan years, it was just prior to Iridium and Echelon and Promise, but even then, I remembered a couple of things. I caught two people monitoring my phone calls when I was in the federal government. I sensed something was going on, and so instead of hanging up, I just kept listening on the phone. And finally, not one but two voices came on the line talking to each other about me. And the same thing at my home. What happens is, let's say you wanted to monitor John Leffler, but you didn't want to go to a court or some judge.
Why would anybody want to do that anyway?
Whoever.
Yeah, right. Okay. I mean, I don't understand why they'd want to do that. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, but you didn't want to have to go before a court and justify monitoring John Leffler, and you didn't want people to know you were monitoring John Leffler. Well, what you would do is give a friend the same phone number as John Leffler, and then you can say, oh, we weren't monitoring John. We were monitoring Jane Smith, but it just happened to be that Jane and John would have the same phone number. In my case, it was President Nixon's private secretary, Rosemary Woods. They gave me the same phone number, home phone, as Rosemary Woods, and we would get these calls from people saying, is Rosemary there? And I complained to the phone companies, oh, yeah, we'll change it, but they didn't. So there's various ways they get around, technically, the law so that they can sweep up this incidental information.
One of the ways, you mentioned echelon, and we haven't mentioned that word a long time ago. One of the ways that happens is somebody can go before Congress and say, no, we didn't collect information about those people, but our friends, the Australians, did, and they happened to give it to us. Okay, so we were talking about conceptualizations about the deep state. I mean, it was really obvious when President Trump came in that there were a lot of people that were opposed to his presidency, and they are determined, and I say are because it's in the present tense, to undermine his presidency, which of course happened to Ronald Reagan too. Now, I'm sure it's happened to a certain degree to every president that they would damp out orders and see that things got stonewalled before they went any further. I remember saying on the program, even before he took office, I think "you're fired" is going to have to become one of his favorite words if he's going to get that under control. So, as you pointed out to me, the deep state's been existing for quite some time.
Yeah, and what they do is to thoroughly understand, they've been around a long time, how to do that, how to evade detection. They have plausible deniability. For example, well, you have to have a reliable source. So a reliable source that I would use is the former Special Ops Chief for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Fletcher Prouty. He had a number of books, and one of them was The Secret Team. And in there, he's explaining, I'll just quote this briefly, the secret team consisting of security-cleared individuals in and out of government who receive secret intelligence data gathered by the CIA, the NSA. The secret team has very close affiliations with elements of power in more than 80 foreign countries and is able, when it chooses to topple governments, create governments. So there's the secret entities. They ran into it right after World War II as well. There was a fellow named James Stewart Martin who was working on behalf of the Justice Department. He was trying to go over there, and he wrote a book called All Honorable Men. And he was trying to sort out the relationship of the American and German businesses during the war, and he kept getting stopped. And he said whatever it was that stopped us was not, quote, the government, but it clearly had command of channels through which the government normally operates. And so what you find is that the power elite, Rockefeller, for example, in the late 1800s, these individuals were not what you would call free enterprise capitalists. Rockefeller, John D., actually said competition's a sin, and they really like socialism. And I've mentioned this 1911 cartoon where these guys, Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, are standing around greeting Karl Marx with a book called Socialism under his arm. And they would develop these long-range plans, and they'd work with other people to develop this. They would have a religious aspect, Walter Rauschenbusch. They were going to get in socialism, sneak it in. And one of your previous programs, you had talked with Robert Curry, saying that it began around the time of Woodrow Wilson. And that's probably as good a point as any, because you have these powerful people, and they have what I called agents, like Colonel House was the one who managed Woodrow Wilson. He wrote a book, Philip Drew Administrator, and it was designed, he said, to have socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx, and they would actually form a cadre. It began primarily in England first, which you had the deep state. You would have, in 1895, the London School of Economics was set up by the Fabian Socialists to train bureaucrats, because prime ministers would come and go, but the bureaucrats would be there and actually run the place. And we know that they were successful in this because H.G. Wells, who was an original Fabian Socialist, they have a famous window where he's there down the bottom left, thumbing his nose at the rest of them. It's not because he disagreed with him. He just thought they should come out in the open. And he wrote a book in 1907 called New Worlds for Old, where he called it a plot. He said, yeah, this is the plot that we're about.
So let's move that up towards more modern times now.
So speeding on up towards mid-1900s, there's a good book called Essence of Decision. It's by Graham Allison. He's a Harvard professor, and he gives the executive model, the administrative model, and the bureaucratic model. and they have ways of operating. There was a little cartoon where it's talking about this bureaucrat, and it says, "We rule because we have ways to handle matters." You put people on hold and make them repeat their name over and over again, aggravate them, and they have various delaying tactics. So in terms of, let's say, when I was in the Reagan administration, what I found out was then, and we would have Bill Clinton and then Barack Obama, what you find is that people don't really understand when they say the bureaucracy, like the deep state, the bureaucracy, and who's really running things.
Right.
They think of these pencil pushers, but there's really two types of bureaucrats. What happened with Reagan was Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton did the same, and Barack Obama has just done the same, is they would convert at the last minute a lot of political appointees to civil service. Then you can't just say, well, you're fired. If it's a political person, you just kick them out. But what they do with important bureaucratic positions is they convert these individuals to civil service, and then you have to give cause for getting rid of people, or there's some other such mechanism. But they're in strategic positions where they can actually run the government. You say, well, no, it's Congress that makes the laws. Forget it. In terms of the deep state, what happens is every law goes to the department that covers it, transportation, commerce, education, whatever it is. And they're the bureaucrats, and believe me, it's these political types who've been converted to civil servants who are doing this in strategically important positions. They're the ones who write the rules and the regulations for the laws. That's what's enforced, not the law. Sometimes a legislator doesn't even recognize it once these people have gotten through with it, but that's the enforcement mechanism. The rules and regulations that enforce the laws is what is really important, and that's where these people sit. Now, what they do is they have a revolving door, like they're in the federal government, they're in the Carter administration, Reagan comes in. They can't convert all of them to civil service. The ones they can't, they go back where they came from, like to a foundation, Carnegie Foundation, Rockefeller, whatever. And then when the appropriate time comes and Bill Clinton comes, they flood back into the government. And that's why it's so important. For example, with the Department of Education, I wrote a column in Investors Business Daily about abolishing it, which was one of Reagan's primary goals. Jimmy Carter had established it, because even if you say, well, I'm the president and I'm going to be in charge of giving the authority back to the states, the individuals who are there, a lot of them in the Department of Education, for example, are smiling at Betsy DeVos and saying, yes, we'll work with you, common ground and all that sort of stuff, because they want to maintain the superstructure so that when she and Trump leave eventually, it won't be so difficult to reconstitute their network again. We actually had a statement that we circulated that said personnel is policy. And that's true. Personnel is policy. You can write all the good policy you want, but if it goes into the deep state and you have these political appointees who, let's say, are a bunch of Obama leftists who have been converted to civil service, they can delay stuff. They can give you reasons, especially if you're inexperienced, as to how it can't happen this way. And I'm sure they're, telling all kinds of secretaries of commerce and transportation that sort of thing to obfuscate and prevent whatever agenda President Trump tries to enlist among them. And then there's also the sort of international component of these things. And that's where you get into Russia and so forth. In one of my books, Secret Records Revealed, I put how Dmitry Manwelsky in 1931 had addressed the Comintern. And he says, in 50 years or so, we will have the greatest peace offensive the world has ever seen, and the West, stupid and decadent, will fall for it. And lo and behold, 50 years almost the date, pops Gorbachev. And so they'll use this wherever it is, the Kremlin, it doesn't matter. They do the same sort of tactics. So you really need to be knowledgeable about who these people are and how they operate.
Is there any way to bust that up? Because, if you try to do certain things, you'll say, oh, well, you need to have all these experienced people in government. Otherwise, disaster will follow.
Yeah, that's a good example. That's one of the things they say, these experienced people. Yeah, you can say, well, there's budgetary considerations. So because of budget constraints, we're going to have a RIF, that's like RIF, reduction in force, and you justify it that way. Therefore, you simply wipe out positions, 10%, 20%, 30%. And Reagan did some of that. He did some RIFs. The other thing is, The good thing from the left perspective or the deep state perspective is they can be converted from political to civil service, and it's harder to get rid of them. The bad thing with that is you're now just a civil servant, so I am going to transfer you, a transportation expert, to the South Pole. We really need you there. You can transfer these people, and there's not that much they can do about it. So there are ways to bust up the network. What you have to watch out for, though, is what I would call happened about 100 years ago when you have Teddy Roosevelt as the champion trust buster. When you're in school, you learn how he's a great trust buster. He broke up Standard Oil. Well, not really. Teddy Roosevelt was the Paralete's other candidate. And by other candidate, I mean the period of Woodrow Wilson. What the Paralete did, and one of the Paralete members was Bernard Baruch. According to Curtis Dahl, FDR's son-in-law in his book, My Exploited Father-in-Law, he used to think that FDR was really smart, Wilson and all that, but he described how Bernard Baruch